lonely rancher hired a native widow to clean the home as a joke. Until she shocked them all, Thomas McCabe stood in the center of his ranch, gazing at the wide expanse of land before him. The wind carried the scent of the earth, the smell of horses and cattle, and the faint hint of pine trees from the surrounding forest. But today, like many others, it felt empty. His boots scraped against the dirt as he walked through the barn, checking on the livestock, but his mind wasn't focused on the animals. It was on the house that was once filled with the sounds of laughter, warmth, and the smells of dinner being prepared. Now it was silent, and so was his heart. After his wife Mary had passed away years ago, life on the ranch had been different. It wasn't that Thomas couldn't take care of the ranch on his own. He had been raised to do so. His father had taught him how to manage the land, how to fix fences, tend to cattle, and even how to survive in the harsh weather conditions that could come at any time. But none of that mattered anymore. What truly bothered him was the emptiness. There was no one to share the evening meal with, no one to talk to while tending the garden, no one to help him with the seemingly endless chores. The house was quiet in a way that made it feel even colder than it really was. The old rocking chair his wife used to sit in by the window still creaked, but now it was a reminder of how much was missing from his life. Thomas had grown used to the solitude. He had become a master of his routines, waking up early, working hard, and then spending the evening alone in his home. But even the strongest of men need help now and then. It was one evening, as Thomas sat at his kitchen table, a mug of coffee in front of him, that he voiced his frustration out loud. "I need someone to clean this place up," he muttered to himself. It had been weeks since he'd really given the house a deep cleaning, and the dust was beginning to pile up. The furniture looked worn, the windows were streaked with grime, and the floors had lost their shine. But it wasn't just about the cleaning. It was about having someone there. Even if just for a few hours. A thought lingered in his mind for a few days. He remembered a woman in the nearby town, a native widow by the name of Sarah Blackwater. She had a reputation for being a quiet, hard-working woman who kept to herself after the death of her husband. People spoke of her in hushed tones, mostly out of respect. But Thomas, in his lonely state, found himself thinking about her in a different way. What did he have to lose? After all, he wasn't asking for much. He just needed someone to help with the cleaning, maybe organize things a bit, and keep the place from falling into disrepair. He wasn't expecting much more than that. He had heard rumors about Sarah being a bit of a recluse, but that didn't bother him. He didn't mind someone who kept to themselves. He had gotten used to it. The idea of hiring Sarah seemed simple enough. A quick way to get his house in order, and perhaps someone to have a bit of company with in the evenings. With this thought in mind, Thomas made the decision. He had no intentions of overcomplicating things, and certainly no expectations of forming any kind of lasting bond. This was simply a practical solution to his problem. He had heard that Sarah was looking for work, and it was as simple as making a trip into town and offering her the job. The next morning, Thomas saddled his horse and rode into town. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the landscape as he traveled the familiar path. It wasn't a long ride, but it gave him time to think about how this would all play out. He wasn't sure what Sarah would say. He didn't even know if she'd accept the offer, but he was hoping she would. When Thomas arrived at the small cabin where Sarah lived, there was no sign of movement inside. The wooden shutters on the windows were drawn, and the small yard was empty. For a moment he hesitated. Maybe she wasn't home, or maybe she wasn't interested in taking on work like this. He knocked on the door, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath his feet. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing Sarah standing in the doorway. She was as he had remembered, tall, with dark hair that hung loosely around her shoulders and a calm expression that seemed both peaceful and unshakable. Her eyes met his, but there was no warmth there, only curiosity. "McCabe," she said softly, "I was wondering if you might be interested in some work," Thomas said, his voice rough from the early morning air. "It's just a bit of cleaning around the house. I've got a lot to do, and I can't keep up with it all." Sarah regarded him for a moment. The silence between them stretched before she finally spoke. "Cleaning?" she asked. "What kind of work are you offering?" Thomas gave her a brief explanation. He kept it simple, not wanting to make it sound like anything more than what it was. He told her about the dust, the clutter, and the general state of the house. He assured her that there was no pressure, that it was just a way to get things in order for a while. To his surprise, Sarah agreed. She didn't seem excited, but neither did she seem reluctant. She simply nodded, as if this was just another task in her day. The deal was made, and Thomas gave her the details of when he expected her to start. She said she would come the next morning. As Thomas rode back to his ranch, he couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the change he had been waiting for. The next morning, as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Sarah arrived at the ranch. She didn't speak much, but she was punctual. Thomas showed her inside and gave her the run of the house, pointing out where the cleaning supplies were stored and which areas he thought needed the most attention. He offered her a cup of coffee, but she declined. It was clear she was here to work, not make conversation. Sarah moved quietly around the house, as if she had done this 100 times before. Her movements were swift, yet graceful. Thomas watched her for a while, unsure of what to expect, but as he stood there, he began to notice something. She wasn't just cleaning, she was transforming the house. The place began to look different, almost alive. There was a quiet energy in the air that he hadn't felt in years. At first, Thomas thought it was just his imagination. Maybe it was the fact that someone was finally helping him. Maybe it was the simple act of having another person in the house. But as he sat down to eat lunch later that day, he realized that something had indeed changed. The house felt different, brighter, warmer, more inviting. Little did Thomas know, Sarah Blackwater's arrival was only the beginning of something that would change his life forever. The days passed slowly but steadily as Sarah continued to work at the ranch. Every morning she arrived before the sun had fully risen, ready to take on the tasks Thomas had set for her. She moved through the house with purpose, cleaning, organizing, and making small changes that Thomas hadn't even noticed were needed. At first, he stayed out of her way, preferring to focus on his own work around the ranch. But as time went on, he found himself drawn to the way she transformed the place. It wasn't just the cleaning that impressed him. It was the way she handled every task with a quiet efficiency that seemed to breathe life back into the house. The floors that had once been covered in dust now shone. The kitchen that had been filled with clutter now sparkled. And the rooms that felt cold and empty now seemed warmer, filled with the sense of care that Sarah put into every corner. Thomas began to notice small things. The way Sarah moved through the house, graceful yet purposeful. She didn't hurry, yet she always seemed to be ahead of schedule, finishing tasks quickly and with such thoroughness that Thomas was often left in awe. She didn't speak much, except when she needed to ask a question or give a simple reply. But her silence wasn't awkward. It was as though she was at peace with her work and the space around her. He didn't mind the quiet anymore. In fact, he found it comforting. It was a different kind of stillness than the loneliness he had become so used to. It wasn't empty silence, but a silence filled with purpose. One evening, after a long day of working outside, Thomas found himself sitting in his usual spot at the kitchen table. sipping on a cup of coffee. It had been a tough day, one of those days when nothing seemed to go right. The cattle had wandered off, and he'd spent hours looking for them, only to find they had crossed the boundary line onto a neighbor's land. By the time he got back to the ranch, the sun was already setting and his muscles ached from the day's work. But when he walked into the house, he noticed something had changed. The kitchen, which had once been cluttered with dirty dishes and half-used ingredients, was spotless. The stove was clean, the counters free of the usual clutter. The smell of fresh-baked bread filled the air, and there was a warm glow from the lanterns hanging on the walls. For the first time in a long while, the house felt like a home again. Sarah was sitting at the table, a small pot of stew in front of her, stirring it quietly. She had already set the table, placing plates and silverware with careful precision. She didn't say anything when Thomas entered, but he could feel the change in the atmosphere. It wasn't just that the house was clean. It was that it felt cared for. There was a warmth in the air, a comfort that hadn't been there before. Without thinking, Thomas walked over to the table and sat down. "I didn't expect you to make dinner," he said, surprised by the simple yet thoughtful gesture. Sarah looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. There was a hint of a smile on her lips, though it was brief. "I thought you might be hungry after your long day," she replied softly. For a moment, Thomas didn't know what to say. He was used to doing everything himself, from cooking to cleaning to fixing whatever needed fixing. He had grown accustomed to a solitary life, and he wasn't sure how to react to this small act of kindness. But as he sat there, staring at the steaming bowl of stew in front of him, he realized how much he had been missing. It wasn't just the food. It was the feeling of being cared for, of having someone look out for him when he wasn't looking for it himself. He took a bite, and the rich flavors of the stew warmed him from the inside. He hadn't even realized how hungry he was until that moment. As he ate, he found himself watching Sarah. She wasn't just a worker to him anymore. She was something else, a presence in the house that he couldn't quite put into words. She was strong, capable, and quiet in a way that was comforting. And as the days passed, he began to appreciate the way she carried herself, her calm demeanor, and her ability to handle everything that came her way without complaint. One evening, as Sarah was cleaning the fireplace, Thomas found himself standing in the doorway watching her. She was so focused on her work, moving with such grace, that he couldn't help but admire her. He had never seen a woman work so hard without a word of complaint, without any desire for recognition. She did her job because it was what needed to be done, and she did it with a quiet dignity that left him in awe. "Sarah," he finally said, breaking the silence, "how did you learn to do all this? It's more than just cleaning." She paused for a moment, then looked up at him.
"It's how I was raised," she said simply.
"My people valued hard work, taking care of the land, and helping one another. I learned from my mother and grandmother. They taught me how to care for a home, how to heal, and how to listen to the world around me. When you're alone, you learn quickly how to survive, how to make do with what you have." Her words surprised him. He had never given much thought to her background, to her life before she came to work at the ranch. But now, hearing her speak of her upbringing, he realized how much he had overlooked. There was more to Sarah than he had ever considered. She wasn't just a widow looking for work. She was a woman with a rich history, a history that shaped her into the person she was now. As the weeks went by, Thomas found himself more and more intrigued by Sarah. He began to spend more time in the house with her, asking questions about her life, her family, and the traditions of her people. They spoke about many things, about the land, about the changes in the town, and about the struggles Sarah had faced in her life. But even as their conversations deepened, there was still an unspoken understanding between them. Neither of them was looking for anything more than what they had: a quiet respect, an unspoken bond formed by the simple act of sharing a space. There were no grand gestures, no promises made, only the unspoken truth that they had both found something in each other that had been missing for a long time. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as they sat by the fire, that Thomas realized just how much Sarah had changed the ranch. It wasn't just the house that had transformed. It was the way he felt when he woke up in the morning, the way he moved through the day, and the way he came home at night. He no longer felt the same emptiness. The loneliness that had once consumed him was slowly being replaced with something else, something he couldn't quite name, but something he knew was important. Sarah had done something he hadn't expected. She had made him feel like he wasn't alone anymore. As the weeks passed, Sarah's presence on the ranch became more than just a necessity. It became something Thomas relied on without fully realizing it. Each day he noticed more and more how she had changed the place. The house that had once felt like a cold, empty shell now felt like a warm, welcoming home. Her quiet energy seemed to breathe life into the ranch, and the feeling of peace she brought was something Thomas had not felt in years. One afternoon, as Thomas worked in the barn, he noticed Sarah standing at the fence, watching the horses graze in the field. She had a calm, thoughtful expression on her face, and he couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. He had learned a little about her past, how she had grown up in a small community, how her life had been shaped by the land, and how she had lived through so much loss. But even with all he knew, there were still parts of her he didn't understand. "Sarah," Thomas called, walking over to where she stood, "what do you think of the horses?" She turned to him, her expression softening. "They are strong animals," she said. "They carry the weight of the land with them, just like we do. But they also know when to rest. They understand the rhythm of life. People could learn a lot from them." Her words struck Thomas deeply. It was true. He had never thought about the animals in that way before. He had always seen them as tools for the ranch, something to be managed and cared for, but never as something that carried the same burdens as the people who worked alongside them. Sarah had a way of seeing things from a perspective he hadn't considered. It wasn't just the land or the animals that mattered to her. It was the way everything was connected, the way each part of life had its place and purpose. Over time, Sarah began to take on more responsibilities around the ranch. She wasn't just cleaning anymore. She had a hand in everything, from tending to the garden to fixing small repairs around the house. Thomas, who had always done everything himself, began to rely on her help more and more. It wasn't out of necessity anymore, but out of appreciation for the way she worked, the way she approached every task with care and attention. One day, as Thomas was walking back to the house after a long day in the fields, he saw Sarah standing near the well. She had a small basket in her hands filled with herbs she had gathered from the garden. He knew she had been working on a special mixture for some of the animals, something to help with their health, but he had no idea how skilled she truly was. "Sarah, you've been working hard," Thomas said, walking up to her. "What are you making now?" She smiled slightly, her hands brushing over the herbs in the basket. "This is for the horses," she said. "A mixture to help with their joints. I learned this from my grandmother. She always knew how to make things grow, how to help heal the land and the animals." Thomas was taken aback. He had never realized how much Sarah knew about herbs and natural remedies. He had always thought of her as a quiet, capable woman, but he had never known the depth of her knowledge. It was as if every day she revealed a little more about herself, and with each new thing he learned, he was more amazed by her. She wasn't just cleaning the house or tending the garden. She was an expert in things that most people, including Thomas, knew little about. That evening, as Sarah worked in the kitchen, Thomas sat at the table watching her. He had grown so used to her presence that it almost felt like she had always been there. It was strange to think of the ranch before she arrived. The house had been a place of solitude, a place that lacked warmth and life. Now there was a sense of harmony in the air, a balance between work and rest, a quiet respect for the land and the animals. Sarah had brought something to the ranch that Thomas hadn't even known it was missing. As Sarah set a bowl of stew in front of him, Thomas couldn't help but ask the question that had been on his mind for a while. "Sarah," he began, his voice hesitant, "why did you come here? I mean, what made you decide to work on this ranch?" Sarah didn't immediately answer. She took a seat across from him, her hands folding in her lap as she stared at the fire crackling in the hearth. For a moment, Thomas thought she wouldn't answer at all. But then she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "When my husband passed, I had no family left. The people in my village were kind, but they had their own lives to live. I couldn't stay there, not after everything that happened. I came here because I thought I could start over, maybe find some peace."
I didn't expect to find work, and I didn't expect anything from you. But what I found here, on this land, has been more than I could have ever imagined.
Her words were simple, but they held a weight that Thomas hadn't anticipated. He realized then that Sarah wasn't just working for him because she needed the job. She had come to the ranch to heal, to find a place where she could rebuild her life, just as he was trying to rebuild his own. There was no grand plan, no expectation of anything beyond survival. But as the days went on, their connection grew. It wasn't something either of them had planned, but it was something neither of them could ignore. Sarah had become more than just a worker on the ranch. She had become a part of it, a part of his life. And Thomas found himself more and more grateful for her presence. The change was subtle at first, like a breeze shifting through the trees. It wasn't until one evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset over the horizon, that Thomas realized how much Sarah had changed him. He had always been a man who kept to himself, who avoided getting close to anyone. But in Sarah's presence, he felt something different. It wasn't just the comfort of having someone to talk to, it was the sense of connection, of shared purpose. As they sat there, Sarah turned to him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "Thomas," she said softly, "sometimes we don't see the changes in ourselves until they've already happened. But when I look at this place, at what we've built together, I see that change. I see that it's not just the land or the house that has changed, it's us too." Her words lingered in the air between them, and for the first time in a long time, Thomas realized how true they were. The ranch had changed, yes, but so had he, and so had she. They were no longer strangers passing through each other's lives. They had become a part of something bigger, something that neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. The days grew warmer as spring settled over the ranch. The once barren fields began to blossom, and the animals, now well cared for, seemed to thrive under Sarah's watchful eye. Thomas found himself slowly adjusting to the rhythm of life with her around. There were no more long, lonely nights by the fire. Instead, they shared quiet evenings, talking about the ranch, the land, and sometimes about their pasts. But there was something different now. The distance that had once existed between them, between him and the world, had started to close. Sarah's presence, her calm strength, had made the house feel fuller, the days lighter, and the nights a little less lonely. And, slowly, Thomas started to realize that he had come to rely on her more than he had expected. One afternoon, when the sun was high in the sky and the air was warm, a problem arose that neither of them had anticipated. As Thomas worked in the fields, he noticed some of the cattle were missing. It was an unusual occurrence. Thomas was meticulous about keeping track of his herd, and the cattle were never allowed to wander off. He quickly rode out on horseback, hoping to find them nearby. The land was vast, and the cattle could be anywhere. He spent hours searching, circling the hills and fields, but there was no sign of them. As dusk began to fall, Thomas felt frustration rising inside him. This wasn't just about losing cattle. It was about losing control of something that had always been in his grasp. When he returned to the ranch, tired and worn from the day's search, he noticed Sarah standing by the barn. She had her arms crossed, watching the horizon. Thomas didn't even need to say anything. She could tell by the look on his face that something wasn't right. "The cattle are gone," he said, his voice flat. "I've searched everywhere." Sarah nodded, her eyes narrowing as she thought for a moment. "You've been looking in all the usual places," she said slowly. "But sometimes the cattle don't go where you expect them to. I think they might have gone up the North Hill, near the old creek. They tend to find shelter there when a storm is coming." Thomas raised an eyebrow, surprised that she had already thought of something he hadn't. "The North Hill?" he repeated. "I didn't even think to look there, but it's been so dry lately I didn't think they would head there." Sarah gave a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes animals know things we don't. They feel the changes in the weather before we do. If we hurry, we might still catch them before dark." Without another word, they both mounted their horses and set off toward the North Hill. The journey was long, and as they rode, Thomas found himself reflecting on what had happened over the past few months. He had always thought of the ranch as his responsibility, something he had to do alone. But now, with Sarah at his side, it felt like a shared endeavor. It wasn't just his problem. It was their problem. And together, they could solve it. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as they reached the top of the hill. The air was cooler now, the evening breeze carrying the scent of fresh grass and earth. Thomas dismounted and walked carefully to the edge of the hill, scanning the area for any sign of the cattle. After a few moments, he heard the familiar low sound of cattle mooing in the distance. His heart lifted. They were here. As they moved closer, they saw the herd gathered near the creek, sheltered beneath a grove of trees. The cattle had found their way to the cool shade, avoiding the heat of the day. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had found them, thanks to Sarah's intuition. "Well, I'll be," Thomas muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "How did you know?" Sarah shrugged, her expression calm and knowing. "I've spent enough time around animals to understand their behavior. They're smarter than we give them credit for." Thomas couldn't help but smile. Sarah's knowledge of the land, of animals, and of the natural world was something he had come to rely on more than he realized. She wasn't just a cleaning woman or a helper around the house. She was someone who understood the world in a way that most people didn't. They spent the next few hours rounding up the cattle and guiding them back to the ranch. It wasn't easy work, but it was necessary. As they rode back side by side, Thomas found himself reflecting on how much he had learned from Sarah. She had taught him to look at the world differently, to pay attention to the small details that others might overlook. When they finally returned to the ranch, the stars were beginning to twinkle in the dark sky. They were both exhausted but satisfied with the work they had done. As they dismounted, Sarah looked over at Thomas, her expression unreadable. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes you have to lose something to realize what you have. I think today was a reminder for you." Thomas looked at her, not sure what to say. She was right, of course. He had spent so much time trying to control everything, trying to keep the ranch in perfect order, that he hadn't realized what he was missing. Someone to share it with, someone who understood the land as he did, someone who was there when things went wrong. "You're right," Thomas said quietly. "I've been so focused on the ranch I didn't see what was right in front of me." Sarah gave a small, understanding smile, and for a moment, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a quiet understanding that they were no longer just two people passing through life, but two people connected by something deeper. Over the next few weeks, the ranch continued to thrive under their combined efforts. The cattle were well cared for, the house was always clean and welcoming, and the fields grew lush and green. But it wasn't just the physical changes that stood out. It was the way Thomas and Sarah had come to rely on each other, the way their bond had grown stronger without either of them realizing it. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, watching the sunset, Thomas realized how much Sarah had changed his life. She had started as a hired worker, a stranger he had brought in to help with the chores. But now she was an irreplaceable part of his life, someone he could count on, someone who had become more than just a companion on the ranch. She had become a friend, a partner, and someone he deeply respected. As the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the hills, Thomas looked at Sarah, his voice soft and sincere. "I don't know how to thank you, Sarah. You've done more for this ranch, and for me, than I ever expected." Sarah looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the fading light. "We've done this together," she said simply. And in that moment, Thomas realized how true her words were. They had done it together, built something stronger than either of them could have done alone. The months passed quickly, and as the seasons shifted, so did the relationship between Thomas and Sarah. The ranch, once a place of solitude and silent sorrow for Thomas, had transformed into a home filled with purpose and companionship. The quiet rhythms of the day no longer felt lonely or repetitive. They now carried the sense of shared effort and mutual respect. Sarah's presence had filled the gaps in his life in ways he hadn't even known he needed. The transformation wasn't just in the house, but in Thomas himself. The mornings were brighter now. Thomas would wake to the smell of fresh coffee brewing, the sound of Sarah moving quietly through the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast. It was a small routine, one he had taken for granted in the past, but now it was something he cherished. When Sarah asked him to join her at the table, it felt like a welcome invitation to be a part of something, a life that was no longer just his own. They worked side by side, handling the ranch's needs together. Sarah's knowledge of the land, of the animals, and of the way things worked was invaluable. She had a calm and steady presence that made even the most difficult tasks seem manageable. When the weather turned rough and the skies threatened with heavy rain, she knew exactly how to prepare the barn, how to shelter the animals, and how to make sure nothing was left to chance. Thomas, who had once done everything himself, now found comfort in having Sarah there, handling tasks with ease. She didn't need him to show her what to do. She just knew. And, for the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel the need to carry all the weight alone. But it wasn't just in the work that they had grown closer. It was in the quiet moments, the times when they sat together on the porch after a long day, watching the sunset as the orange and pink hues painted the sky, or the evenings when they would have dinner together, talking about the small details of their day or sharing stories from their pasts. There were no grand declarations, no promises made. It was a simple companionship that had deepened over time, a bond forged through shared labor and mutual respect. One evening, as they sat together, Sarah looked out at the horizon, her expression thoughtful. The night was beginning to fall, and the stars were just starting to appear in the darkening sky. It was a moment that felt timeless, like a memory that would stay with him forever. "Thomas," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence, "do you ever think about what comes next?" Thomas, who had been watching the stars, turned to look at her. Her eyes were distant, as if she were considering something important. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice soft. "I mean," she said, her voice steady, "we've both been through a lot. We've been working side by side in this ranch, this land. It's been good for us. But what happens when we've fixed everything here? What happens when the work is done?" For a moment, Thomas didn't know what to say. He hadn't really thought about it in that way before. The ranch had been a constant, something he had poured all his energy into, something that had defined his life for as long as he could remember. But now, with Sarah beside him, the future felt different. It wasn't just about maintaining the ranch anymore. It was about something more. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I've spent so many years just working, trying to keep things going. I guess I never thought about what happens after. But I do know this. I never thought I'd find someone like you, someone who makes all of this feel real." Sarah's gaze softened as she looked at him.
It's not just about the work, Thomas, she said, her voice gentle. It's about having someone to share it with.
"We can keep working, keep building, but we also need to make space for each other, to take time for the things that matter outside of the chores, the land, and the animals." Her words hung in the air between them, and Thomas felt something shift inside him. He had spent so many years building a life based on the work, on what needed to be done, that he had forgotten to live. He had been so focused on making sure everything was perfect that he had overlooked the simple things, the moments of quiet joy, the shared laughter, and the bond that was growing between them. "What do you think comes next, Sarah?" he asked after a long pause. She looked at him with a faint smile, her eyes bright in the dim light. "I think we'll keep going, but we'll do it together. We'll keep working the land, but we'll also take time to enjoy the moments we have. We'll keep building, not just the ranch, but a life, a real life, not just for the work, but for the people who matter." Thomas couldn't help but smile at her words. They were simple, but they held a truth that resonated deeply within him. He had spent so much of his life alone, thinking that work was the only thing that mattered. But now, with Sarah beside him, he realized there was so much more to life than just getting by. There was joy to be found in the small moments, the quiet conversations, the shared meals, and the time spent together on the porch, watching the sunset. In the weeks that followed, the ranch continued to thrive, but so did their connection. Sarah and Thomas grew even closer, working together in a way that was natural and effortless. They laughed more, talked more, and began to share dreams for the future. It wasn't about making grand plans or promises. It was about building something lasting, something real. One evening, as they stood by the barn watching the stars appear in the sky, Thomas turned to Sarah and said, "I'm glad you came here, Sarah. I don't know where I'd be without you." She looked at him, her expression warm and genuine. "I'm glad too," she said softly. "I think we both needed this." As the days passed, the seasons changed again. The ranch continued to grow, and with it, so did their bond. They had built something together, a life, a home, and a future that was no longer defined by loneliness or hard work alone. It was defined by their partnership, their shared experiences, and the deep respect they had for each other. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt at peace. The ranch was no longer just a place to work. It was a place to live, to grow, and to share with someone who understood him in a way no one else ever had. Together, they had created a life that was built on more than just the land. It was built on trust, companionship, and the quiet strength that had always existed between them, even before they fully realized it. And as they stood together, watching the night unfold around them, Thomas knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Whatever challenges the future held, they would be ready, for they had already built something stronger than the land itself, a partnership that would endure no matter what. The days stretched into weeks, and the seasons slowly began to change once again. The harsh heat of summer gave way to the crisp, refreshing coolness of fall. The ranch, once a place of loneliness and quiet routine for Thomas, had transformed into a lively, thriving home, thanks to Sarah. It was more than just the house and land that had changed. It was the way Thomas felt about everything around him. The work on the ranch never stopped. There were always tasks to be done, fences to mend, animals to care for, crops to harvest, but it didn't feel like the exhausting, endless cycle it once had. With Sarah by his side, the work felt more like a shared purpose. Together, they had made the ranch thrive in a way Thomas had never thought possible. She had brought a sense of calm and focus to his life, a kind of steadiness that he had been missing for so long. One evening, after a long day of work, Thomas sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand, staring out of the window. The sun had just set, casting a soft, golden light over the land. He could hear the faint sounds of the animals in the distance, the wind rustling through the trees. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at ease. Sarah entered the room, her soft footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. She was carrying a basket of freshly picked apples, their sweet scent filling the room. She set the basket down on the table and looked at Thomas. "You've been quiet today," she said, her voice gentle. Thomas smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Just thinking," he said, "about how much things have changed." Sarah sat down across from him, her dark eyes meeting his.
What do you mean?
"I mean, when I first came here, I never thought it would be like this," he said, gesturing to the ranch around them. "I thought I'd always be alone, just working, trying to keep everything together. But now I realize that the work isn't what matters most. It's having someone to share it with." Sarah's gaze softened, and she nodded. "I understand. Life has a way of showing us what we need, even when we don't realize it." Thomas looked at her, his heart filled with gratitude. "I never thought I needed someone," he said, his voice quiet. "But having you here, it's made everything feel different. Better." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind outside and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Thomas had never been one to open up easily, but with Sarah, he felt like he could speak the truth. The truth was simple. He had needed her. He hadn't realized how much he had been missing until she came into his life. Sarah reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. "I'm glad I came here, Thomas. I never expected it either. But this ranch, this life, it's become something I never thought I would have again. You've given me a chance to start over, to find peace." Thomas's heart stirred at her words. He hadn't realized how much she had given to him, too. She had brought so much more than just her skills or hard work to the ranch. She had brought a sense of purpose and belonging, a sense that together they could face whatever challenges came their way. As the days went by, the bond between them deepened. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about the small moments, the quiet understanding that grew stronger with every passing day. They worked side by side, each taking on their own responsibilities, but always coming together when the work was done. Even the smallest tasks felt significant when they shared them. There were days when they would sit together on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset behind the hills, and talk about their hopes for the future. Sarah would share stories from her past, of the small village she had come from, of the family she had lost, and of the lessons her grandmother had taught her about the land. Thomas, in turn, spoke of his childhood, of the years he had spent running the ranch on his own, and of the quiet loneliness he had endured after his wife's passing. They found comfort in each other's stories, each sharing a piece of themselves that had been buried deep for so long. In the silence that followed, they would sit together, simply enjoying the company. It wasn't just about filling the space with conversation. It was about sharing a life that was no longer just his or hers, but theirs. One evening, as they walked through the garden, admiring the crops that had flourished under their care, Thomas stopped and looked at Sarah. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I never realized how much I had been missing. Not just the work, but the connection. The feeling of having someone by your side, someone who understands." Sarah looked at him, her eyes bright under the fading light. "We all need someone, Thomas. Even the strongest of us can't do everything alone." Thomas nodded, feeling a deep sense of understanding in her words. He had spent so many years believing that he had to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, but now, with Sarah beside him, he realized that he didn't have to. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. It was during one of these quiet moments as they stood together by the garden that Thomas realized something profound. He had been afraid of change for so long, afraid to let anyone in after the loss of his wife. But Sarah had shown him that change wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. She had come into his life unexpectedly, and together they had created something stronger than either of them could have built alone. Their days continued to pass, each one blending into the next, filled with hard work, shared laughter, and quiet moments of connection. The ranch was thriving, and so was their relationship. They had built a life together, one that was grounded in respect, trust, and the understanding that, no matter what came their way, they would face it side by side. As winter approached, the air grew colder, and the first snowflakes began to fall. The ranch, which had flourished under the warmth of the sun, now took on a new beauty, one that was quiet and serene. Thomas stood at the window, looking out at the white-covered land, and for the first time in years he felt at peace. He turned to Sarah, who was sitting by the fire, a small smile on her lips. "I never imagined it would be like this," he said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. Sarah smiled back, her eyes warm. "Neither did I," she said softly. They both knew that their journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, still work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, they knew they were ready. Together, they had built something that would last, a partnership that went beyond the ranch, beyond the work, and deep into the heart of their shared life. And as they sat together, the warmth of the fire flickering in the background, Thomas knew one thing for certain: he was no longer alone. With Sarah by his side, he had everything he needed.